The story of the Mughal Empire begins not in the palaces of Delhi, but in the snow-capped mountains of Central Asia, where a young prince's destiny was shaped by dreams, prophecies, and the blood of two legendary conquerors flowing through his veins. In the fertile valleys of Fergana, a small kingdom nestled between the great empires of the world, a boy named Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad was born in the year 1483. The world would come to know him as Babur, meaning tiger in Persian, though in these early years he was more lamb than predator, struggling to understand his place in a world shaped by the shadows of his ancestors. His lineage was nothing short of mythical. Through his father's blood, he descended from Timur, the great conqueror, who had built towers of skulls and created an empire stretching from Damascus to Delhi. Through his mother's line flowed the blood of Genghis Khan, whose Mongol hordes had reshaped the known world 2 centuries before. These two streams of conquest and ambition merged in young Babur, creating a destiny that seemed written in the stars themselves. The chroniclers tell us that on the night of Babur's birth, wise men and astrologers gathered to read the signs. They spoke of a dream his mother had experienced, a radiant light descending from the heavens, entering her dwelling and illuminating the entire valley of Fergana. This light, they proclaimed, foretold that her son would kindle a new sun in a distant land, establishing a dynasty that would blend the traditions of many peoples into something unprecedented and magnificent. Yet prophecies and noble blood meant little in the harsh realities of Central Asian politics. When Babur was merely 11 years old, his father Umar Sheikh Mirza died in a sudden accident. His dovecote collapsed while he was tending his beloved pigeons, sending him tumbling into the ravine below. In an instant, the young boy found himself thrust onto the throne of Fergana, surrounded by ambitious uncles, treacherous nobles, and neighboring kingdoms eager to devour his small realm. The early years of Babur's life read like an epic poem of loss and perseverance. 3 times he conquered the fabled city of Samarkand, the jewel of his ancestor Timur's empire. 3 times he lost it. His own relatives conspired against him, his trusted generals betrayed him, and at one point he wandered the mountains with barely a handful of loyal followers, reduced to eating wild berries and sleeping in caves. During these wilderness years, something profound happened to young Babur. He began to write, pouring his experiences into what would become the Baburnama, one of history's most intimate royal memoirs. In its pages, we find not just the record of battles and conquests, but the musings of a sensitive soul who noticed the beauty of flowers, the taste of different melons, and the pain of separation from loved ones. This combination of warrior and poet, conqueror and aesthete, would become the defining characteristic of the dynasty he would found. It was during his darkest hour, when he had lost everything including his ancestral kingdom of Fergana, that Babur received a vision that would change the course of history. Some say it came in a dream, others that a wandering Sufi mystic whispered it to him, but the message was clear. His destiny lay not in the blood-soaked battlefields of Central Asia, but far to the south, beyond the legendary Khyber Pass, in the rich plains of Hindustan. The land that beckoned to him was no stranger to Muslim rule. 3 centuries earlier, Turkish and Afghan dynasties had established the Delhi Sultanate, bringing Islam to the subcontinent. But by Babur's time, the Sultanate had fragmented, with the Lodis ruling a diminished realm from Delhi, while independent kingdoms flourished across the land. To the south lay the mighty Vijayanagara Empire, to the west the proud Rajput kingdoms, and scattered throughout were numerous smaller principalities, each guarding its independence jealously. As Babur stood at the threshold of the Indian subcontinent in 1519, making his first tentative raids into the frontier regions, he carried with him more than just ambitions of conquest. He brought the accumulated wisdom of Turco-Mongol statecraft, the aesthetic sensibilities of Persian culture, the military innovations of Central Asian warfare, and perhaps most importantly, a vision of empire that transcended mere dominion over territory. In his memoirs, Babur would later write of a peculiar dream that visited him repeatedly during this period. He saw a great tree growing from barren soil, its roots reaching deep into the earth, while its branches spread wide enough to shelter multitudes. Birds of every feather nested in its boughs, some singing in Persian, others in Turkish, and still others in tongues he did not recognize. When he woke, he understood this to be a sign of the empire he was destined to create, one that would draw strength from multiplicity, offering shelter to all who sought its shade. The mystical elements surrounding Babur's destiny were reinforced by the spiritual traditions of his time. He was deeply influenced by the Naqshbandi Sufi order, whose teachings emphasized the unity underlying apparent diversity. This philosophical foundation would prove crucial in shaping his approach to ruling a land where Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Islamic traditions had coexisted for centuries. Unlike previous conquerors who had seen India merely as a source of plunder, Babur began to envision himself as a gardener who would cultivate this rich soil into something extraordinary. The signs and portents continued to accumulate. When Babur first crossed into India proper, legend tells that an aged Sufi saint approached his camp. The holy man carried with him an ancient manuscript that purported to contain a prophecy from the time of the Delhi Sultanate's founding. It spoke of a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan who would renew the glory of Muslim rule in India, but through wisdom rather than mere warfare, creating a kingdom where the crescent and the lotus would bloom together. These mystical beginnings would profoundly influence how the Mughal Empire understood itself throughout its existence. Unlike empires built purely on military conquest or economic exploitation, the Mughals saw their rule as divinely ordained, but also divinely constrained. They were not merely conquerors, but inheritors of a sacred trust to bring justice, beauty, and harmony to a fractured land. This sense of destiny, rooted in dreams and prophecies, would sustain them through triumphs and tragedies alike. As the stage was set for one of history's most remarkable imperial adventures, the convergence of practical ambition and mystical vision created a unique foundation. Babur was simultaneously a hard-headed military strategist who understood the importance of gunpowder technology and battlefield tactics, and a mystic poet who believed in signs and dreams. This duality would characterize the empire he founded: pragmatic in administration, yet romantic in vision; Islamic in faith, yet inclusive in practice; Central Asian in origin, yet destined to become thoroughly Indian. The prophecies surrounding Babur's birth and destiny were not mere superstitions to those who lived them. They provided a narrative framework that transformed military conquest into divine mission, that elevated political ambition into spiritual quest. As you drift toward sleep, imagine young Babur on the eve of his invasion of India, standing beneath the stars that his ancestors had used to navigate the steppes, reading in their patterns the confirmation of his destiny. Tomorrow he would begin the journey that would transform him from a dispossessed prince into the founder of one of history's greatest empires. But tonight he was still a dreamer, shaped by visions of what might be. The year 1526 dawned with portents of change sweeping across the northern plains of Hindustan. In the pre-monsoon heat of April, two armies faced each other on the historic battlefield of Panipat, a site that would witness the rise and fall of empires throughout Indian history. On one side stood Ibrahim Lodi, the Sultan of Delhi, commanding a force of 100,000 men and 1,000 war elephants, an army that seemed invincible by the standards of traditional Indian warfare. On the other stood Babur with merely 12,000 battle-hardened Central Asian warriors, their numbers small but their tactics revolutionary. What Babur lacked in numbers, he compensated with innovation and strategy. He had brought with him the secrets of Ottoman military success: gunpowder artillery and matchlock muskets, weapons still rare in Indian warfare. More importantly, he employed the Turco-Mongol tactic of Tulugma, a complex maneuver involving flanking cavalry movements that would encircle and confuse the enemy. As the morning mist lifted from the battlefield, Babur arranged his forces in a formation that would become legendary in military history. The battle itself lasted only half a day, but its consequences would reverberate for centuries. Ibrahim Lodi's elephants, terrified by the thunder of cannon fire, turned and trampled their own forces. The Sultan's numerical superiority became a disadvantage as his troops, packed too densely, could neither advance nor retreat effectively. By noon, Ibrahim Lodi lay dead on the battlefield, and with him died the 320-year-old Delhi Sultanate. Babur, the homeless prince who had wandered the mountains of Central Asia with nothing but dreams of destiny, suddenly found himself master of one of the world's richest cities. Yet victory at Panipat was only the beginning of Babur's challenges. As he entered Delhi and later Agra, he discovered a land vastly different from anything he had known. The heat was oppressive to a man raised in the cool mountains of Fergana. The monsoon rains, unknown in Central Asia, brought both relief and disease. His soldiers, accustomed to the austere landscapes of their homeland, found themselves overwhelmed by India's sensory abundance. The kaleidoscope of colors, the symphony of languages, the bewildering variety of customs and faiths. In his characteristic honesty, Babur wrote in his memoir about his initial disappointment with Hindustan. He complained about the heat, the dust, the lack of good melons and grapes, the absence of bathhouses and madrasas in the Central Asian style. His men, homesick and uncomfortable, begged him to return to Kabul with the wealth they had plundered. For a moment, the nascent Mughal Empire hung in the balance as its founder wrestled with doubt about his prophetic destiny. The turning point came through an unexpected source, the very land that seemed so alien. As Babur explored his new domains, he began to notice things that his initial disappointment had obscured. The sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water through the plains spoke of engineering knowledge accumulated over millennia. The intricate carvings on temple walls revealed artistic traditions of breathtaking refinement. The complex system of village governance showed a society capable of self-organization without constant imperial oversight. Most importantly, Babur discovered that India's diversity, which had initially seemed chaotic, actually contained a hidden order. Different communities had developed methods of coexistence, allowing Hindu temples and Muslim mosques to stand side by side, permitting various languages to flourish in their own spheres, while Sanskrit and Persian served as languages of learning. This organic pluralism, though sometimes disrupted by conflict, offered a model for governance different from the forced uniformity common in other empires. The challenges of establishing foundations in this new land were immense. The Rajput confederacies, with their ancient warrior traditions and deep connection to the land, viewed Babur as merely the latest in a long line of invaders, to be resisted or accommodated as circumstances demanded. Local chiefs who had paid nominal allegiance to the Delhi Sultanate saw its collapse as an opportunity for independence. Most pressingly, the treasury was nearly empty, as the costs of conquest had exceeded the immediate plunder. Babur's response revealed the pragmatic wisdom that would characterize successful Mughal rule. Rather than attempting to impose Central Asian systems wholesale, he retained much of the existing administrative structure, the traditional division of provinces, the methods of tax collection. Even many of the officials remained in place. He understood that an empire could not be built on military might alone. It required the consent, or at least acquiescence, of the governed. The foundation of Mughal military power also required adaptation. The traditional Central Asian cavalry, supreme on the open steppes, had to learn to fight in India's varied terrain, dense forests, marshy riverlands, hill fortresses that could withstand lengthy sieges. Babur began recruiting local soldiers who understood these conditions, creating the hybrid military that would become the Mughal trademark. He established arsenals to produce gunpowder weapons locally, reducing dependence on imports from the Ottoman lands. Cultural foundations proved equally important. Babur, despite his personal nostalgia for Central Asian ways, recognized that his empire's future lay in synthesis rather than replacement. He commissioned translations of Indian texts into Persian, seeking to understand the traditions of his new subjects. He retained Hindu festivals in the court calendar, understanding that respect for local customs would earn more loyalty than forced conversion. Most significantly, he began the practice of matrimonial alliances with Rajput princesses, not merely as political arrangements, but as bridges between communities. The economic foundations of the new empire required careful attention. The existing system of land revenue, refined over centuries, was too valuable to discard. Babur retained the traditional divisions of crop sharing between cultivator and state, though he insisted on more careful record-keeping. He encouraged trade by maintaining security on the major routes, understanding that merchant communities were essential for imperial prosperity. The famous Mughal karkhanas, workshops, had their origins in Babur's efforts to combine Central Asian craft traditions with Indian techniques. Perhaps most importantly, Babur laid the psychological foundations for Mughal rule. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate successor to the Delhi Sultanate, maintaining continuities that eased the transition. He cultivated relationships with Sufi saints and Hindu holy men, understanding that spiritual authority could complement temporal power. His accessible justice, where even common people could petition the emperor directly, created an image of fairness that contrasted with the arbitrary rule of the late Sultanate. The gardens Babur created during these foundation years were more than personal indulgences. They were statements of intent. In Agra, he laid out the Ram Bagh, adapting the Persian Charbagh design to Indian conditions. These gardens, with their geometric water channels and shaded pavilions, showed how foreign aesthetics could be naturalized in Indian settings. They became spaces where different communities could meet on neutral ground, where the synthesis that would define Mughal culture could begin to take shape. As his health began to fail, worn down by the Indian climate and years of hardship, Babur faced a final test of his foundational work. His son, Humayun, fell gravely ill, and court physicians despaired of his recovery. According to legend, Babur walked around his son's sickbed, praying that the illness might transfer to him. Whether through divine intervention or coincidence, Humayun recovered while Babur's health rapidly declined. This act of paternal sacrifice would become part of Mughal law, establishing the dynasty as one guided by human emotion as well as political calculation. In December 1530, after only 4 years as Emperor of Hindustan, Babur died. His final testament revealed the complexity of the foundations he had laid. He asked to be buried in Kabul, acknowledging his Central Asian roots. Yet he left detailed instructions for governing India that showed his deep engagement with his new realm. He advised tolerance, justice, and patience, virtues essential for ruling a diverse empire. The foundations Babur established in those 4 brief years would prove remarkably durable. He had shown that foreign conquerors could become Indian rulers, that Islamic and Hindu traditions could coexist under a single sovereign, and that military might must be balanced with cultural sensitivity. As you continue drifting towards sleep, picture the first Mughal emperor in his final days, weak in body but satisfied in spirit, knowing that though the edifice was incomplete, the foundations were solid enough to support the magnificent empire his descendants would build. The death of Babur in 1530 thrust the nascent Mughal Empire into a crisis that would test whether his vision could outlive its founder. Humayun, whose name meant fortunate, would prove to be perhaps the most ironically named ruler in Mughal history. Where Babur had been decisive, Humayun was contemplative to the point of paralysis. Where his father had been pragmatic, the son was given to astrological consultations and elaborate ceremonies. Yet it would be through Humayun's very failures that the Mughal Empire would undergo its first great transformation, emerging stronger and more authentically Indian. The challenges facing the new emperor were formidable. His brothers, following Timurid tradition, each claimed portions of the empire as their rightful inheritance. Afghan nobles who had served under the Lodis questioned why they should submit to another foreign dynasty. Most dangerously, in the eastern provinces of Bihar and Bengal, an ambitious Afghan noble named Sher Khan Sur was quietly building a power base that would soon challenge Mughal authority itself. Humayun's early reign revealed both his strengths and fatal weaknesses. He was cultured, learned in astronomy and mathematics, and possessed of an aesthetic sensibility even more refined than his father's. He created elaborate court ceremonial based on cosmic principles, dividing his courtiers into groups representing the elements and conducting business according to astrological timings. But while Humayun contemplated the heavens, more earthly powers were moving against him. The transformation began with catastrophe. Sher Khan Sur, who had carefully studied Mughal military tactics and administrative methods, proved to be not just a rebel, but a visionary ruler in his own right. At Chausa in 1539, Sher Khan's forces caught Humayun's army off guard, inflicting a devastating defeat. The emperor barely escaped with his life, famously crossing the Ganges on an inflated water skin provided by a humble water carrier. In gratitude, Humayun would later honor this man by allowing him to sit on the throne for a day, a gesture that revealed both his nobility and his sometimes misplaced priorities. The following year brought complete disaster. At Kanauj in 1540, Sher Shah, as Sher Khan now styled himself, crushed the reorganized Mughal forces. This defeat was not merely military, but psychological. The aura of invincibility that Babur had created through his victories at Panipat and Kanwa evaporated. Humayun, emperor of Hindustan, became a fugitive in his own realm, fleeing westward with a handful of loyal followers, including his pregnant wife Hamida Banu Begum. The journey that followed would become legendary in Mughal history. Through the scorching deserts of Rajasthan and Sindh, the imperial party struggled to survive. They ate berries and hunted small game, sometimes going days without water. At one point, reduced to desperate circumstances, they were forced to eat horsemeat, a last resort for people of Turco-Mongol heritage. Hamida Banu Begum, heavily pregnant, showed remarkable fortitude, enduring hardships that would have broken many. When she gave birth to the future Emperor Akbar at Umarkot in 1542, it was in the humble dwelling of a local Raja who had offered them temporary shelter. For 15 years, Humayun remained in exile while Sher Shah Sur and his successors ruled from Delhi. This period of wandering took him eventually to the court of Shah Tahmasp of Persia, where he would spend several years absorbing new ideas about governance, art, and culture. The transformation of Humayun from failed emperor to sophisticated cosmopolitan occurred gradually in the Persian court. He studied Persian miniature painting techniques, delving deep into an art form that would later flourish under Mughal patronage. He observed Safavid administrative methods, particularly their integration of religious and temporal authority. Most importantly, he learned that successful empire building required more than military conquest. It demanded administrative efficiency, cultural patronage, and the ability to synthesize diverse traditions. Meanwhile, in India, Sher Shah Suri was inadvertently preparing the ground for eventual Mughal restoration. His 5-year reign, though brief, introduced administrative innovations that would profoundly influence future Mughal governance. He reorganized the revenue system, creating detailed land surveys that assessed each plot according to its productivity. He standardized currency and weights across his realm. Most famously, he built the Grand Trunk Road, a highway stretching from Bengal to the northwest frontier that would become the backbone of subcontinental communications for centuries. When Sher Shah died in 1545 from wounds sustained in a gunpowder explosion while besieging a Rajput fortress, his empire began to fragment. His son, Islam Shah, maintained control for a few years, but after his death in 1554, rival claimants tore the Sur Empire apart. This chaos provided Humayun, now backed by Persian military support, with his opportunity for return. The price of Persian aid was high: temporary conversion to Shia Islam and the promise of Kandahar, but Humayun judged it worth paying for the chance to reclaim his patrimony. The empire Humayun reconquered in 1555 was vastly different from the one he had lost. The intervening years had shown that India could not be ruled as a Central Asian principality. Sher Shah's administrative reforms had raised expectations of governmental efficiency. The brief Sur interregnum had demonstrated that the Mughals were not invincible, emboldening regional powers to assert greater autonomy. Most significantly, it had become clear that successful rule in India required not just military dominance, but administrative sophistication and cultural integration. Humayun's response to these changed circumstances, though he would have less than a year to implement it before his death, laid crucial groundwork for the transformation that would fully flower under his son Akbar. He retained many of Sher Shah's administrative innovations, recognizing their superiority to previous systems. He brought back from Persia not just military advisors, but artists, architects, and scholars who would help create the distinctive Indo-Persian culture of the mature Mughal court. The physical and cultural monuments of this transformation were just beginning to take shape when fate intervened. Humayun commissioned the construction of Din Pana, a new city in Delhi designed to showcase the fusion of Persian and Indian architectural traditions. He began collecting manuscripts for what would become the legendary Mughal Library, understanding that cultural patronage was as important as military conquest. He initiated the practice of incorporating Indian nobles into imperial service, moving beyond the ethnic exclusivity that had characterized early Mughal rule. The transformation was also deeply personal. The years of exile had humbled Humayun, teaching him empathy for the powerless and appreciation for the loyalty of those who had shared his hardships. The birth of Akbar during the darkest period of exile had shown him that dynasty could survive even catastrophic defeat. His time in Persia had exposed him to Shia practices and Sufi mysticism that broadened his religious outlook beyond the Sunni orthodoxy of his youth. On January 24, 1556, Humayun's story came to an abrupt end in a manner that seemed to epitomize his star-crossed life. Descending the stairs of his library, that sanctuary of learning he had so carefully assembled, he heard the call to prayer. In his haste to respond, he caught his foot in his robe and fell, striking his head on the stone steps. He died 2 days later, leaving behind a 13-year-old heir and an empire once again in crisis. Yet Humayun's true legacy lay not in his military victories or architectural projects, but in the transformation his failures had necessitated. Through defeat and exile, the Mughal Empire had been forced to evolve from a foreign imposition into a more authentically Indian institution. The rigid Central Asian traditions had been tempered by Persian sophistication and Indian pragmatism. The narrow military elite had been broadened to include diverse communities. Most importantly, the idea of what the Mughal Empire could be had expanded from mere territorial conquest to cultural synthesis. This first great transformation established patterns that would define Mughal resilience for generations. The empire had learned it could bend without breaking, absorb influences without losing its essential character, and emerge from crisis stronger than before. As you sink deeper into restful sleep, imagine Humayun in his final moment, falling in his library surrounded by the books that represented the synthesis he had begun. Persian poetry, Indian philosophy, works on astronomy and mathematics from across the known world. In that tragic instant lay both ending and beginning, the close of one chapter and the opening of another in which his son would complete the transformation he had begun. The year 1556 found the Mughal Empire at its most vulnerable moment since Babur's initial conquest. The 13-year-old Akbar, thrust onto the throne by his father's untimely death, faced a situation that would have overwhelmed seasoned rulers. Afghan generals who had served under the Surs were marching on Delhi, confident they could brush aside this boy emperor. Regional governors appointed by Humayun declared independence, sensing weakness at the center. Most critically, a Hindu general named Hemu, who had risen from humble origins, selling saltpeter to become the power behind the Sur throne, had crowned himself Raja Vikramaditya and was advancing with a formidable army to reclaim Delhi. In this moment of supreme crisis, young Akbar was fortunate to have by his side Bairam Khan, a loyal general who had served his father through exile and restoration. It was Bairam Khan who marshaled the Mughal forces for what would be the Second Battle of Panipat, fought on the same ground where Babur had established the empire 30 years earlier. The battle's outcome hung in the balance until a chance arrow struck Hemu in the eye, causing his elephant to bolt from the field. With their leader fallen, Hemu's forces dissolved, and the Mughal Empire was saved. Yet military victory only exposed deeper internal conflicts that threatened to tear the empire apart. The Mughal nobility was divided along ethnic lines. The foreign-born Persians and Central Asians, known as Iranis and Turanis, looked down upon Indian Muslims and Hindus. They monopolized high offices and expected the young emperor to rule as a Muslim sovereign over conquered infidels. Bairam Khan himself, though loyal, ruled as regent with an increasingly heavy hand, making decisions without consulting the maturing emperor and enriching his own faction at the expense of others. The first evolution came from Akbar himself in 1560, when, at 17, he orchestrated a palace coup against his overbearing regent. But rather than execute Bairam Khan as court protocol might have demanded, Akbar showed early signs of the wisdom that would characterize his reign. He offered his former guardian the choice of a generous retirement or a pilgrimage to Mecca. This merciful treatment of a potential rival signaled a new approach to internal conflicts, one that sought reconciliation over retribution, integration over exclusion. With personal control established, Akbar began addressing the fundamental contradictions of Mughal rule. How could a Muslim dynasty claiming Central Asian heritage establish legitimacy over a predominantly Hindu population? How could the empire's diverse nobility be unified when they spoke different languages, followed different customs, and harbored ancestral animosities? The young emperor's solutions would revolutionize the very nature of the Mughal state. The revolution began with what historians would later call the Mansabdari system, an innovation that replaced traditional feudalism with a meritocratic bureaucracy. Every noble, regardless of origin, was assigned a numerical rank, mansab, that determined their salary, military obligations, and position in court hierarchy. Promotion depended on merit and imperial favor rather than birth or ethnicity. This system created a service nobility loyal to the emperor personally, rather than to ethnic groups or regional power bases. A Rajput who proved himself in battle could rise higher than a Turkish noble who rested on ancestral laurels. But Akbar's most radical innovation was his policy toward the Hindu majority. Breaking with centuries of Islamic precedent, he abolished the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims that had symbolized their inferior status. He prohibited the forcible conversion of prisoners of war and ended the practice of enslaving the families of defeated enemies. In 1562, he married a Rajput princess from Amber, modern Jaipur, not as a mere political alliance but as a full royal marriage, allowing her to maintain her Hindu faith and customs within the imperial harem. This matrimonial alliance opened floodgates of change. Rajput princes, who had resisted Muslim rule for centuries, began joining imperial service. Raja Man Singh of Amber became one of Akbar's most trusted generals, leading campaigns that extended the empire's frontiers. Raja Todar Mal revolutionized the revenue system with his detailed land surveys and fair assessment methods. The sight of Hindu nobles in high positions scandalized Orthodox Muslims, but Akbar pressed forward with his inclusive vision. The internal conflicts this generated were intense. Conservative ulama accused the emperor of apostasy. Muslim nobles who had expected to maintain their monopoly on power found themselves competing with Hindu officials. Some provinces erupted in rebellion, led by governors who claimed to be defending the true faith against an emperor who had lost his way. The most serious challenge came from Akbar's own half-brother Mirza Hakim, who ruled Kabul and claimed to be the rightful defender of Islamic orthodoxy against his heretical sibling. Akbar's response revealed the evolution of Mughal political philosophy. Rather than meet religious arguments with religious counter-arguments, he developed the concept of sul-i-kul, absolute peace, which held that the emperor's duty was to ensure harmony among all religious communities. He established the Ibadat Khana, house of worship, at his new capital of Fatehpur Sikri, where scholars from different faiths, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and even atheism, could debate theological questions in his presence. These discussions led Akbar to an even more radical conclusion. In 1579, he issued the Infallibility Decree, which made him the supreme arbiter of religious disputes within his realm. This wasn't a claim to prophetic authority, but an assertion that in matters where Islamic law was unclear or contradictory, the emperor's judgment would prevail. Orthodox Muslims were horrified, but Akbar had effectively separated religious authority from political power, creating space for a multi-religious state. The cultural evolution was equally profound. Akbar commissioned translations of Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana into Persian, making them accessible to the Muslim elite. He adopted Hindu festivals like Diwali and Holi as court celebrations. The art of his court began reflecting this fusion. Miniature paintings showed Hindu gods and Muslim saints with equal reverence, while architectural projects combined Islamic geometrical patterns with Hindu decorative motifs. The administrative evolution transformed governance. Todar Mal's revenue reforms created a system that would endure for centuries. Land was carefully surveyed and classified according to productivity. Revenue demands were fixed in cash rather than kind, encouraging commercial agriculture. The empire was divided into sabars, provinces, each with parallel civil and military administrations that checked each other's power. This sophisticated bureaucracy could function regardless of the religious or ethnic background of its officials. Perhaps nothing exemplified this internal evolution better than Akbar's new capital at Fatehpur Sikri, built between 1571 and 1585. The city was a stone manifestation of Mughal inclusiveness. The Buland Darwaza proclaimed imperial might, but nearby stood palaces for his Hindu wives, complete with temple spaces. The Diwan-e-Khas featured a central pillar where Akbar sat, literally and symbolically, above sectarian divisions, connected to his diverse courtiers by bridges that represented his role as unifier. Yet this evolution came at a price. Akbar's own son, Prince Salim, later Jahangir, rebelled against him, partly encouraged by Orthodox Muslims who hoped a new emperor would reverse the inclusive policies. Several major rebellions in Bengal, Bihar, and the Deccan challenged imperial authority, but the new system proved resilient. The diverse nobility, bound together by shared service and imperial favor, rallied to the emperor. The administrative machinery continued functioning despite political upheavals. By the end of Akbar's reign in 1605, the internal conflicts that had threatened to tear the empire apart had been largely resolved through revolutionary evolution. The Mughal Empire was no longer a foreign Muslim dynasty ruling over Hindu subjects, but an authentically Indian empire that drew strength from its multiplicity. The Mansabdari system had created a meritocratic nobility where talent mattered more than origin. Religious tolerance had become state policy. Persian remained the court language, but it had absorbed thousands of Hindi words, creating the distinctive Mughal vocabulary that would evolve into Urdu. This evolution established principles that would sustain the empire through future challenges. As your consciousness drifts toward dreams, consider the magnitude of this transformation. In just 50 years, the Mughal Empire had evolved from a foreign conquest state into a sophisticated multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity. The boy emperor who had nearly lost his throne had become Akbar the Great, and the empire he shaped through resolving its internal contradictions would dazzle the world for generations to come. The morning mists rising from the Narmada River in 1591 carried with them the smoke of siege engines and the distant sounds of battle drums. Akbar, now in the 35th year of his reign, stood before the fortress of Asirgarh, the key to the Deccan, contemplating an expansion that would transform the Mughal Empire from a northern Indian power into a subcontinental colossus. The conquest that lay ahead would test not just military might, but the very principles of inclusive governance that had revolutionized internal administration. The expansion had begun decades earlier with the systematic absorption of the Indo-Gangetic heartland. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied on lightning raids and temporary submissions, Akbar pursued a methodical strategy of permanent incorporation. When the fertile province of Gujarat fell in 1573, it brought with it not just territory, but access to the Arabian Sea and the wealthy ports that connected India to global trade networks. The emperor celebrated by making a legendary march from Fatehpur Sikri to Ajmer, covering the distance in just 9 days, to give thanks at the shrine of the Sufi Saint Moinuddin Chishti. But expansion meant more than military conquest. Each new territory brought unique challenges that forced the Mughals to innovate and adapt. In Bengal, conquered in 1576, the empire encountered a sophisticated riverine civilization with its own literary traditions and commercial networks. The Mughal response was characteristic. Rather than impose uniform administration, they adapted to local conditions, using riverboats for revenue collection and incorporating Bengali Hindu zamindars into the administrative framework. The conquest of Kashmir in 1586 presented different lessons. This mountain paradise, with its legendary gardens and skilled craftsmen, had maintained independence through geographical isolation. When it finally submitted to Mughal rule, Akbar spent months in the valley, not as conqueror, but as student, learning about saffron cultivation, studying the techniques of Kashmir's famous shawl weavers, and planning gardens that would blend Mughal formal design with Kashmir's natural abundance. The incorporation of Kashmir brought more than territory. It brought new aesthetics that would influence Mughal art for generations. Yet it was in the Deccan that Mughal expansion faced its greatest tests and learned its most crucial lessons. The sultanates of the Deccan, Bijapur, Golconda, Ahmadnagar, Bidar, and Berar, represented a different kind of challenge. These were not Hindu kingdoms that could be won over by religious tolerance or tribal territories that could be subdued by superior military technology. These were sophisticated Muslim states with their own claims to legitimacy, their own Persian cultural connections, and their own traditions of governance. The siege of Ahmadnagar in 1595 became legendary not for its military tactics, but for the figure who emerged as its most formidable defender. Chand Bibi, the regent queen, organized such spirited resistance that Mughal forces found themselves stalemated for months. When a cannonball breached the fort walls, she appeared in armor to personally lead the repair efforts, inspiring her troops to fight with renewed vigor. The eventual Mughal victory came not through assault, but through internal treachery, teaching Akbar that in the Deccan, political intrigue was as important as military might. Each expansion brought encounters with new forms of resistance and required new strategies of incorporation. The Rajput kingdoms that had not yet submitted employed guerrilla tactics in their hill fortresses, forcing the Mughals to develop new siege techniques. The tribal areas of Afghanistan and the northwest frontier required constant military presence and delicate negotiation with clan leaders. The Portuguese enclaves on the western coast introduced the Mughals to European military technology and global trade networks, leading to complex diplomatic negotiations. The most profound lessons came from failures. Akbar's attempts to conquer the entire Deccan were repeatedly frustrated by the distances involved, the difficult terrain, and the united resistance of the sultanates. The campaign to subdue the Yusufzai Afghans in 1586 resulted in the death of his closest friend, Raja Birbal, teaching the emperor that some territories were better controlled through negotiation than conquest. The expansion into Bengal's riverine delta regions showed the limits of the traditional Mughal cavalry-based military system. These setbacks led to innovations that strengthened the empire. The Mughals developed a sophisticated intelligence network, with newswriters, Waqia Nawis, in every major city sending regular reports to the capital. They created a flexible military system that could adapt to different terrains, cavalry for the plains, infantry for hill warfare, and river fleets for Bengal. Most importantly, they learned to expand through alliance and accommodation as much as through conquest. The expansion brought unprecedented wealth, but also new responsibilities. Each conquered territory had its own systems of land tenure, taxation, and local governance that had to be understood and integrated. The Mughals developed a remarkable capacity for administrative absorption, studying local practices, retaining what worked, and gradually introducing imperial standards. The famous Ain-e-Akbari, compiled by Abul Fazl, represented an encyclopedic effort to document the diverse systems of the expanding empire. Cultural expansion accompanied territorial growth. As Mughal power extended south and east, it encountered new languages, art forms, and religious traditions. The court became a meeting ground for diverse traditions. Rajasthani painters learned Persian techniques, Bengali poets wrote in Persian, and Deccani musicians introduced new ragas to the imperial court. This cultural cross-fertilization created the composite civilization that would be the Mughal Empire's greatest legacy. The expansion also brought the Mughals into contact with the wider world. Through Gujarat's ports came African slaves who would rise to positions of power, Arab merchants who connected India to the Ottoman Empire, and European traders seeking the legendary wealth of the Great Mughal. The empire's growth made it a major player in what historians would later recognize as the early modern world system, with Mughal coins accepted from Central Asia to Southeast Asia. By 1601, when Akbar's forces finally secured the submission of Asirgarh through a combination of siege and negotiation, the Mughal Empire had grown from Babur's initial territories in the Gangetic Plain to encompass most of the Indian subcontinent. This expansion had not been merely territorial acquisition, but a process of learning and adaptation. Each new province had taught lessons about governance. Each resistance had sparked innovation, and each incorporation had added new threads to the complex tapestry of Mughal civilization. The methodology of expansion established under Akbar would guide his successors. Military conquest would be followed by administrative integration, religious accommodation, and cultural fusion. Local elites would be incorporated into the imperial system while maintaining their regional influence. Defeated rulers would often be confirmed as tributary princes rather than displaced entirely. This flexible approach to expansion created an empire that could encompass multiplicity without enforcing uniformity. Yet the seeds of future challenges were already visible. The Deccan sultanates, though partially subdued, maintained a spirit of independence that would require constant military attention. The Marathas in the Western Ghats were beginning to develop the guerrilla tactics that would later challenge Mughal power. The European trading companies, still minor coastal players, were quietly building the commercial and military capabilities that would eventually rival imperial authority. As Akbar returned from his final Deccan campaign, aged and tired but with an empire stretching from Kandahar to Bengal, from Kashmir to the Deccan, he had reason for satisfaction. The expansion had not just added territory, but had transformed the Mughal Empire into a truly subcontinental power. As sleep draws nearer, imagine the vast expanse of Akbar's empire as he saw it in his final years. Merchants traveling safely on roads, pilgrims visiting sacred sites under imperial protection, artists and scholars moving freely between courts, creating a cultural efflorescence that would dazzle future generations. The year 1605 marked a turning point as momentous as any in Mughal history. As Akbar breathed his last in Agra, possibly poisoned by slow-acting substances administered by his own son's supporters or simply worn down by decades of ceaseless activity, the empire he left behind stood at the threshold of its greatest glory. The rebellious Prince Salim, who took the throne as Jahangir, meaning world conqueror, inherited not just an empire, but a sophisticated system of governance that would propel the Mughals to heights of power and prosperity that would make them the envy of the world. Jahangir's accession itself demonstrated how far the empire had evolved. Despite having rebelled against his father, his succession proceeded smoothly through established mechanisms. The Mansabdari system continued functioning, revenues flowed without interruption, and the diverse nobility transferred their loyalty to the new emperor without the catastrophic wars that might have torn apart a less mature state. This institutional stability would prove to be the foundation upon which the Mughal Golden Age would be built. The new emperor brought his own vision to the throne. Where Akbar had been a warrior administrator, Jahangir was an aesthete and naturalist. His memoir, The Tuzuki Jahangiri, reveals a man fascinated by the natural world, recording detailed observations of flora and fauna with scientific precision. Under his patronage, Mughal painting reached new heights of naturalistic detail. Artists like Mansour became specialists in depicting birds and animals with such accuracy that modern ornithologists can identify species from their 400-year-old paintings. But the real power behind Jahangir's throne was his 20th wife, Mehr-un-Nisa, whom he titled Nur Jahan, Light of the World. Her rise from the widow of a minor official to de facto ruler of the empire exemplified the possibilities for advancement in the Mughal system. Nur Jahan proved to be not just a court intriguer, but a capable administrator who issued imperial orders, struck coins in her name, and led military campaigns. Her architectural patronage, particularly the tomb she built for her father in Agra, established new standards of refinement that would influence the Taj Mahal itself. Under Jahangir and Nur Jahan, the empire consolidated Akbar's conquests and pushed into new frontiers of prosperity. The port cities of Gujarat became windows to the world, with Surat emerging as one of the Indian Ocean's busiest emporia. Here, Mughal officials supervised a complex commercial ecosystem where Armenian merchants rubbed shoulders with Arab traders, where Portuguese Jesuits debated with Muslim clerics, and where the first English ambassadors marveled at wealth beyond their sovereign's dreams. The arrival of Sir Thomas Roe as England's first ambassador to the Mughal court in 1615 provides a revealing glimpse of the empire at its ascendant moment. Roe, expecting to overawe the natives with European sophistication, found himself instead humbled by the magnificence of the Mughal court. His efforts to impress Jahangir with English goods were met with polite disdain. What use did an emperor who received tribute in diamonds have for English woolens? The trading privileges Roe eventually secured came not from strength, but from the Mughals' magnanimous condescension to a minor power from a distant island. The economic foundations of this ascension were remarkable. The Mughal Empire had become the manufacturing hub of the early modern world. Indian textiles, from the finest muslins of Dhaka that could pass through a ring to the sturdy calicos of Gujarat, clothed people from Southeast Asia to West Africa. The imperial workshops produced goods of such quality that Mughal became synonymous with excellence. Steel from Indian forges, particularly the legendary Wootz steel that would be forged into Damascus blades, commanded premium prices in global markets. Agriculture, the foundation of imperial wealth, reached new levels of productivity. The Mughal revenue system, refined over generations, had achieved a delicate balance, extracting enough to support the magnificent imperial establishment while leaving cultivators with incentives to expand production. New crops from the Americas, particularly tobacco and maize, were rapidly adopted and integrated into the agricultural cycle. The countryside hummed with activity as villages produced not just for subsistence, but for urban markets and international trade. This prosperity supported a cultural efflorescence that dazzled contemporary observers. The imperial library grew to contain hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, and regional languages. The translation movement initiated by Akbar accelerated, making texts from different traditions available across linguistic boundaries. Poets and scholars flocked to the Mughal court from across the Islamic world, finding patronage that surpassed even the Ottoman and Safavid courts. When Jahangir died in 1627 and his son Shah Jahan ascended the throne, the empire's trajectory towards supreme magnificence accelerated. Shah Jahan, whose name meant King of the World, intended to make that title a reality. His 30-year reign would mark the absolute zenith of Mughal power, wealth, and cultural achievement. Under him, the empire's revenues reached astronomical figures. By some estimates, the Mughal state's income exceeded that of all European states combined. Shah Jahan's architectural projects announced Mughal supremacy in stone and marble. The new capital he built in Delhi, Shah Jahanabad, was designed as the perfect Islamic city, its broad boulevards and magnificent mosques proclaiming the empire's power and piety. The Red Fort, with its famous inscription, "If there is paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this," became the setting for court ceremonies of unprecedented splendor. The peacock throne, encrusted with the finest gems from across the empire, became the ultimate symbol of Mughal magnificence. But it was in Agra that Shah Jahan created his masterpiece. The Taj Mahal, built as a tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, represented the culmination of centuries of architectural evolution. Persian design principles merged with Indian craftsmanship. Central Asian decorative traditions fused with local marble working techniques, creating a monument that transcended cultural boundaries to achieve universal beauty. The 20-year project employed thousands of craftsmen from across the empire and beyond, becoming a showcase for the diverse talents that Mughal patronage could command. The military might that protected this prosperity was equally impressive. The Mughal army had evolved into a sophisticated force that combined traditional cavalry with artillery corps, elephant units with specialist engineers. The empire's arsenals produced matchlocks and cannon that equaled European models. The navy, though never the Mughals' primary focus, maintained fleets sufficient to protect coastal trade. When Shah Jahan decided to reconquer the ancestral homeland of Kandahar from the Persians, he could mobilize armies of hundreds of thousands, supported by supply systems that were the envy of contemporary military theorists. Yet this ascension was not without its shadows. The very magnificence of Shah Jahan's projects required enormous resources. The tax burden increased, and for the first time in generations, there were signs of strain in the countryside. The emperor's orthodox Islamic policies, reversing some of Akbar's inclusive innovations, created tensions with Hindu subjects. The Portuguese had been expelled from Hugli, but other European trading companies were quietly establishing fortified bases that would prove difficult to dislodge. As the 1650s progressed, the empire stood at its absolute peak. From the Safavid borders to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan, the Mughal writ ran supreme. As you drift deeper into sleep's embrace, picture the Mughal Empire at this moment of supreme triumph. Shah Jahan holding court in the Diwani Khas, surrounded by nobles whose jeweled turbans catch the light filtering through marble screens, while in the markets of Agra and Delhi, the world's goods change hands. This is empire at its most glorious, seemingly eternal in its magnificence. In the year 1658, as the monsoon clouds gathered over the Deccan Plateau, the Mughal Empire stood at a moment of supreme paradox. Never had it been wealthier, more powerful, or more culturally brilliant. Yet the war of succession raging between Shah Jahan's sons would mark the beginning of the end of this golden age. The victor, Aurangzeb, would rule for nearly 50 years, presiding over an empire at its territorial maximum, yet containing within it the seeds of its own decline. The empire that Aurangzeb seized through fratricidal war was a marvel of administrative sophistication and economic dynamism. The imperial revenue system, refined over generations, extracted wealth with remarkable efficiency from an economy that comprised perhaps a quarter of global production. The famous Mughal Karkhanas produced textiles of such quality that European merchants would travel thousands of miles to procure them. In the imperial treasuries, gold and silver accumulated in quantities that stunned foreign observers. The French traveller François Bernier estimated that the empire's annual revenue exceeded £15 million, more than the Ottoman Empire and Persia combined. This golden peak manifested most visibly in the empire's cities. Delhi, with a population approaching 400,000, rivaled Paris and London as one of the world's great metropolises. Its Chandni Chowk, the moonlit square designed by Jahanara Begum, Shah Jahan's daughter, became the subcontinent's premier commercial centre. Here, under the shadow of the Jama Masjid, merchants traded in hundis, letters of credit that were honoured from Kabul to Colombo, demonstrating the sophisticated financial networks that underpinned Mughal prosperity. The cultural achievement of this period was equally remarkable. The imperial library had grown to contain over 300,000 manuscripts, making it one of the world's great repositories of knowledge. Court historians like Muhammad Kazim chronicled contemporary events with unprecedented detail, while poets like Mirza Badil explored mystical themes in Persian verse of extraordinary sophistication. The tradition of miniature painting reached new heights of technical perfection, with artists like Govardhan creating portraits of such psychological depth that they rival any produced in Renaissance Europe. Music and dance flourished under imperial patronage. The classical Hindustani tradition, blending Persian and Indian musical systems, achieved its definitive form in the Mughal courts. Tansen's Gharana continued to produce maestros who could, according to court chronicles, make candles light with Rag Deepak or bring rain with Rag Malhar. The Nautch performances in the imperial Zanana combined Central Asian, Persian, and Indian dance traditions into art forms of mesmerizing sophistication. Yet it was in the realm of architecture that the Golden Peak found its most enduring expression. Beyond the famous monuments, the period saw an explosion of building activity that transformed urban landscapes across the empire. In Lahore, the Shalimar Gardens created a Persian paradise in Indian soil. In Kashmir, Mughal gardens like Nishat Bagh and Chashme-Shahi demonstrated how imperial aesthetics could enhance natural beauty. Every provincial capital boasted mosques, tombs, and palaces that proclaimed Mughal power while providing employment to thousands of craftsmen. The empire's reach extended far beyond its formal boundaries through networks of trade and diplomacy. Mughal merchants dominated Indian Ocean commerce, their ships sailing from Surat to Malacca, from Basra to Mombasa. The empire's diplomatic connections stretched from the Ottoman court in Istanbul to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. When the Sharif of Mecca needed financial support, he appealed to the Mughal emperor. When the rulers of Balkh and Badakhshan quarreled, they sought Mughal mediation. This was also an age of remarkable women who shaped the empire's destiny. Jahanara Begum, reconciling with Aurangzeb despite his imprisonment of their father, became the empire's first lady, patronizing Sufi shrines and commissioning architectural projects. Roshanara Begum wielded significant political influence, while Zebunisa, Aurangzeb's daughter, became a noted poet and patron of letters. These royal women controlled vast resources. Jahanara's personal income exceeded that of many European monarchs. The prosperity of the Golden Peak rested on the productivity of millions of ordinary subjects whose lives, while far from the imperial splendor, had achieved a certain stability and predictability. Village communities across the empire had developed sophisticated systems of local governance, managing irrigation, settling disputes, and negotiating with imperial officials. Artisan guilds in cities maintained quality standards and transmitted skills across generations. The famous Dhaka muslins required such skill that master weavers were celebrities in their own right. Their techniques closely guarded family secrets. Religious and intellectual life during this period displayed remarkable variety despite Aurangzeb's orthodox policies. The emperor himself was a Hafiz who had memorized the Quran and copied it by hand to fund his simple personal expenses. Yet his empire contained thriving Hindu pilgrimage centers, Sikh gurus who commanded devoted followings, and Sufi shrines that attracted devotees from all communities. The great Sufi orders, Chishti, Qadiri, Naqshbandi, and Suhrawardi, maintained networks of khanqahs that served as centers of spiritual guidance and social welfare. Scientific and technical knowledge also advanced during the Golden Peak. Mughal physicians blended Greek, Arab, and Ayurvedic medical traditions, producing treatises that advanced understanding of diseases and treatments. Astronomers at the imperial court made observations that corrected earlier star charts. Engineers developed innovative solutions for water management, creating stepwells and canal systems that turned arid regions into productive agricultural lands. The famous Shalimar Gardens hydraulic systems demonstrated mastery of water engineering that impressed even modern observers. The military might that protected this prosperity had evolved into a formidable force. Aurangzeb's armies, at their peak, numbering over 200,000 cavalry and 40,000 artillery pieces, represented one of the largest organized military forces in the contemporary world. The imperial arsenals produced weapons of quality comparable to European models, while the system of military logistics could sustain campaigns across vast distances. When Aurangzeb decided to conquer the Deccan Sultanates, he could maintain armies in the field for decades, supplied by an administrative apparatus of remarkable efficiency. Yet even at this golden peak, perceptive observers could detect signs of strain. The very size of the empire made effective control difficult. Provincial governors, secure in their distant posts, began exhibiting increasing autonomy. The zamindari system, which had efficiently collected revenue for generations, was showing signs of strain as local strongmen converted their tax-collecting rights into hereditary domains. The European trading companies, still respectful supplicants at the imperial court, were quietly building fortified factories and training sepoy armies. More fundamentally, the economic foundations of the Golden Age contained inherent limitations. The empire's wealth was largely extractive, based on taxing agricultural surpluses and controlling trade routes rather than technological innovation or productivity increases. While European states were beginning to experiment with new forms of finance and proto-industrial production, the Mughal economy remained fundamentally traditional. The very perfection of Mughal administration may have inhibited the kinds of disruptive changes that were beginning to transform Europe. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Mughal Empire, at its golden peak, presented a magnificent facade that concealed growing vulnerabilities. Foreign visitors continued to marvel at Mughal magnificence. The empire's coins remained the most trusted currency across a vast region. When Aurangzeb died in 1707 at the age of 88, still on campaign in the Deccan, he ruled an empire larger than any of his predecessors. As you approach the deepest phase of sleep, let your mind rest in this moment of supreme achievement. The Red Fort, illuminated for a royal wedding, with fireworks reflecting in the Yamuna River, while thousands of lamps turn night into day. This is empire at its zenith, a civilization that had reached the summit of human achievement in its age. As the 18th century dawned with Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal Empire appeared from the outside to be at its mightiest. It commanded territories from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, its treasuries still glittered with accumulated wealth, and its name still commanded respect from Persia to Java. Yet beneath this imposing facade, like termites hollowing out a magnificent wooden palace, forces of decay had been at work for decades, invisible to all but the most perceptive observers. The first symptom of hidden decay manifested in the very succession following Aurangzeb's death. Where previous transitions had been managed, if bloodily, with relative swiftness, the war between Aurangzeb's sons dragged on for years, draining the treasury and destroying the mystique of imperial invincibility. Prince Muazzam, who eventually emerged victorious as Bahadur Shah I, was already 63 years old, exhausted by conflict, and ruling an empire exhausted by his father's endless Deccan campaigns. The new emperor would reign for only 5 years, initiating a pattern of short reigns and succession crises that would plague the empire for the remainder of its existence. The economic decay, though less visible, was more fundamental. The endless wars in the Deccan had cost astronomical sums. By some estimates, Aurangzeb had spent more on his southern campaigns than the total cost of building every major Mughal monument combined. This wealth had not been invested in productive enterprises, but had disappeared into military expenditures, leaving no lasting benefit. The imperial treasury, once overflowing, now struggled to meet basic obligations. Soldiers went unpaid for months, leading to mutinies and defections that further weakened imperial authority. More insidiously, the very foundation of Mughal prosperity, the agricultural economy, was showing signs of strain. The constant demand for revenue to fund military campaigns had led to overtaxation in many regions. Peasants, squeezed beyond endurance, abandoned their lands or rose in revolt. The careful balance between state extraction and cultivator incentive, maintained for generations, had been broken. In regions like Punjab and Bengal, agricultural production declined, reducing the tax base and creating a vicious cycle of increasing demands on a shrinking economy. The Mansabdari system, once the empire's administrative backbone, had degenerated into a hereditary aristocracy more concerned with preserving privileges than serving the state. Mansabdars, who had once been rotated regularly to prevent the development of local power bases, now remained in provinces for decades, building regional networks that challenged imperial authority. The practice of farming out tax collection to the highest bidder led to rapacious exploitation, as collectors sought to extract maximum profit from their temporary positions. Cultural decay paralleled political decline. The vibrant fusion that had characterized Mughal culture at its height gave way to sterile imitation and religious orthodoxy. Aurangzeb's reimposition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims and his destruction of Hindu temples had shattered the delicate balance that had sustained imperial legitimacy among the diverse population. The Rajput allies who had been pillars of Mughal power increasingly distanced themselves from an empire that no longer respected their traditions. The policy of sulh-e-kul, that had been the empire's genius, was abandoned for narrow sectarianism. The imperial court, once a magnet for talent from across Asia, became increasingly insular and faction-ridden. The later emperors, products of harem upbringing with little experience of the world beyond palace walls, lacked the vigor and vision of their ancestors. Farrukhsiyar, 1713 to 1719, was entirely controlled by the Sayyid brothers, who became known as the Kingmakers. Muhammad Shah, 1719 to 1748, called Rangila the Colorful for his love of entertainment, presided over a court more interested in poetry competitions and dance performances than governance. Meanwhile, in the provinces, the decay of central authority allowed ambitious governors and military commanders to carve out semi-independent principalities. In Bengal, Murshid Quli Khan established what was effectively a hereditary governorship, remitting only token revenues to Delhi. In Awadh, the Persian noble Sa'adat Khan laid the foundations of an autonomous state. The Deccan saw the rise of Asaf Jah I, who founded the Nizamate of Hyderabad. These regional powers maintained the forms of Mughal administration while pursuing independent policies, fragmenting the empire from within. The military decay was perhaps most catastrophic. The Mughal army, once the terror of Asia, had become a bloated, inefficient force more dangerous to the countryside it was supposed to protect than to external enemies. The traditional cavalry, armed and organized as their ancestors had been, faced new challenges from enemies who had adopted different tactics. The Marathas, under leaders like Baji Rao I, perfected a form of mobile warfare that ran circles around lumbering Mughal armies. Their cavalry raids penetrated deep into imperial territory, extracting chath protection money from provinces nominally under Mughal control. The European trading companies, once humble petitioners at the Mughal court, had quietly transformed into significant military powers. The British East India Company's victory at Plassey in 1757, though a small skirmish by Mughal standards, demonstrated how far the military balance had shifted. European-trained sepoy armies, disciplined and equipped with modern firearms, proved superior to traditional Mughal forces despite their smaller numbers. The empire that had once overawed European ambassadors now found itself unable to control European merchants. Technological stagnation compounded military weakness. While European powers were undergoing military revolutions, developing new tactics, weapons, and organizational forms, the Mughal military remained frozen in patterns established generations earlier. The famous Mughal artillery, once state-of-the-art, had become cumbersome and outdated. Naval power, always the empire's weakness, became a critical vulnerability as European maritime dominance allowed them to control coastal trade and project power inland via rivers. The religious and social fabric of the empire also showed signs of decay. The Sufi orders that had served as bridges between communities became increasingly orthodox and insular. The tradition of religious fusion gave way to hardening communal boundaries. The Sikhs, transformed by persecution into a military community, controlled much of Punjab. Hindu revival movements, particularly the Marathas' emphasis on establishing indigenous rule, challenged the legitimacy of Muslim sovereignty. The delicate balance of the Mughal composite culture was unraveling. Even in the realm of high culture, decay was evident. The great tradition of Mughal painting declined into repetitive portraiture. Persian poetry became increasingly artificial, valued more for elaborate wordplay than meaningful content. Architecture, while still producing beautiful buildings, lacked the innovative grandeur of earlier periods. The dynamic creativity that had characterized Mughal culture at its height gave way to nostalgic imitation of past glories. Perhaps most tellingly, the idea of the Mughal Empire itself was decaying. Provincial rulers still acknowledged the emperor in Friday prayers and on coinage, but these were empty formalities. Real power lay with regional strongmen, European companies, and insurgent groups like the Marathas and Sikhs. The emperor in Delhi ruled little beyond the city walls, dependent on whichever faction currently controlled the capital. The title, Shah Alam, adopted by more than one 18th-century emperor, ironically means ruler of the world, a hollow boast for monarchs who could barely secure their own palaces. The nadir of humiliation came in 1739, when Nadir Shah of Persia invaded India. The Persian conqueror defeated the demoralized Mughal army with ease and entered Delhi unopposed. For 58 days, his soldiers plundered the capital of its accumulated treasures. The peacock throne, symbol of Mughal magnificence, was carried off to Persia, along with the Koh-i-Noor diamond and untold wealth. The psychological impact was devastating. If the emperor could not defend his own capital, what meaning did the empire have? As you sink deeper into restorative sleep, contemplate this melancholy transformation. The empire that had dazzled the world with its power and culture was hollowing out from within, its decay hidden by the magnificent shell of past achievements. The great workshops still produced beautiful objects, but for regional courts rather than imperial patronage. The Mughal name retained such prestige that even those who had effectively destroyed its power sought its validation. In this extended twilight, the hidden decay that had begun in Aurangzeb's reign would finally consume the last vestiges of the empire Babur had founded with such hope in the distant spring of 1526. The year 1757 would be remembered as the moment when the slow decay of the Mughal Empire transformed into catastrophic collapse. On the fields of Plassey, a modest trading company defeated the Nawab of Bengal, one of the empire's most powerful governors, not through military superiority, but through treachery and the complete breakdown of the imperial system. This battle, small by the standards of earlier Mughal conflicts, marked the beginning of the empire's final crisis, a cascade of disasters that would reduce the once mighty realm to a hollow shell within a single generation. The crisis had been building through accumulated failures, but it exploded with shocking rapidity. Ahmad Shah Durrani's repeated invasions from Afghanistan demonstrated the empire's inability to defend its core territories. In 1761, at the Third Battle of Panipat, the same ground where Babur had established Mughal power, Afghan forces annihilated a massive Maratha army that had been the last indigenous power capable of resisting foreign domination. The battle's aftermath left a power vacuum in northern India that neither the emperor nor any Indian ruler could fill. In Delhi, the crisis manifested in scenes of unprecedented humiliation. Emperor Shah Alam II, blinded by his own nobles, became a pathetic figure dependent on whoever controlled the capital. The Marathas, recovering from Panipat, made him their puppet. When they withdrew, he fell under British protection, a euphemism for captivity. The emperor, who theoretically ruled from the Indus to Bengal, actually controlled nothing beyond the Red Fort's walls, and even there his authority depended on foreign bayonets. The economic crisis paralleled political collapse. The revenue system that had sustained the empire for 2 centuries completely broke down. Regional rulers intercepted tax revenues, European companies diverted trade profits, and agricultural production plummeted due to constant warfare. The great commercial networks that had made Mughal India the workshop of the world fragmented as local conflicts made trade routes unsafe. The rupee, once accepted from Central Asia to Southeast Asia, lost value as multiple authorities issued debased coinage. In Bengal, the British East India Company's rapacious exploitation following their victory at Plassey created a humanitarian catastrophe. The Great Famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, a third of the province's population. The company's agents focused solely on extracting maximum revenue, exported grain even as people starved. This disaster, unthinkable under functioning Mughal administration, revealed how completely the traditional systems of governance and social protection had collapsed. The paternalistic relationship between ruler and ruled, fundamental to Mughal legitimacy, was replaced by naked exploitation. The military crisis deepened as traditional Mughal forces proved utterly incapable of facing European-trained armies. At Buxar in 1764, the combined armies of the Mughal emperor, the Nawab of Awadh and the Nawab of Bengal, representing the empire's last credible military force, were routed by a much smaller British army. The defeat was not just military, but psychological. The mystique of Mughal invincibility, already damaged, was permanently shattered. Provincial rulers rushed to make separate accommodations with the rising British power. The cultural crisis was equally profound. Delhi, repeatedly sacked by invaders, saw its libraries burned, its scholars dispersed, and its artistic traditions disrupted. The great karkhanas that had produced Mughal masterpieces closed as patronage disappeared. Court musicians fled to regional centers, painters sought employment with nouveau riche merchants, and poets lamented the passing of an age. The Persian language, symbol of Mughal high culture, began its retreat before English and regional vernaculars. Religious authority, once a pillar of imperial legitimacy, fragmented completely. The emperor's claim to be defender of Islam rang hollow when he couldn't defend his own capital. Local religious leaders, Sufi peers, Hindu mahants, Sikh gurus, commanded more genuine authority than imperial appointees. Communal tensions, carefully managed under strong Mughal rule, exploded into violence as local strongmen exploited religious differences for political gain. The ideal of Suli Kul seemed a mockery amid sectarian bloodshed. The administrative crisis saw the complete breakdown of the Mansabdari system. Appointments were sold to the highest bidder, often to multiple claimants for the same position. Provincial governors declared hereditary succession, transforming themselves from imperial servants to independent rulers. The elaborate bureaucracy that had been the empire's strength became a predatory burden, with multiple officials claiming authority over the same territories and populations caught between competing extractors. Perhaps most critically, the crisis of legitimacy undermined any possibility of recovery. The Mughal emperor retained theoretical sovereignty. The British would rule in his name until 1857, but this was an empty fiction. Real power lay with whoever commanded the most soldiers or controlled the most revenue. The idea that had sustained the empire, a divinely sanctioned universal monarchy bringing justice and prosperity to all subjects, became impossible to maintain when the emperor was a beggar in his own palace. The regional responses to this crisis varied dramatically. In Hyderabad, the Nizams maintained a semblance of Mughal administration while building an effectively independent state. In Mysore, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan created a modernizing kingdom that briefly challenged British expansion. In Punjab, Ranjit Singh forged a Sikh empire on the Mughal model, but with indigenous religious legitimacy. Each of these successor states preserved elements of Mughal administration while adapting to new realities. The British response to the crisis was to gradually transform from traders to rulers. The East India Company, originally interested only in profit, found itself drawn into administration by the vacuum of authority. They retained Mughal forms. Persian remained the official language. Mughal titles were coveted, and Mughal law codes were maintained, while subverting their substance. This subsidiary alliance system turned Indian rulers into puppets, while maintaining fictions of their sovereignty. The human cost of this great crisis was catastrophic. Constant warfare devastated the countryside. Traditional irrigation systems, maintained for centuries, fell into disrepair as no authority took responsibility for their upkeep. Banditry flourished as unemployed soldiers turned to plunder. The ordered society that had characterized Mughal rule at its height gave way to chaos, where might made right and ordinary people suffered endless exploitation. Contemporary accounts paint horrifying pictures of the crisis. The poet Mir Taqi Mir wrote, "Delhi was once a paradise, where now remains only ruins and thorns." British observers, even while profiting from the chaos, noted the devastation their conquests brought. French mercenaries serving various Indian powers described the complete breakdown of civil order. Persian visitors, remembering Mughal magnificence, were shocked by the empire's degradation. The intellectual response to the crisis produced some of the Mughal era's greatest cultural achievements, born from tragedy. Poets like Ghalib created verses of heartbreaking beauty, lamenting their civilization's destruction. Historians like Ghulam Hussain Khan analyzed the causes of decline with remarkable objectivity. Religious reformers like Shah Waliullah attempted to revitalize Islam for changed circumstances. This cultural flowering amid political collapse recalled the last brilliant flames of a dying fire. By 1803, when the British formally occupied Delhi, the crisis had run its course. The Mughal Empire existed only in name, its emperor a pensioner, its territories divided among successor states and foreign conquerors. The transformation from the world's wealthiest empire to a hollow shell had taken less than a century. The speed of collapse shocked contemporaries who had believed the Mughal order eternal. As you approach deeper sleep, reflect on this great crisis that ended a remarkable chapter in human history. The empire that had seemed eternal proved as mortal as its founders, yet its dissolution was not merely destruction, but transformation. From the crisis emerged new political formations, cultural fusions, and social arrangements that would shape South Asia's future. The Mughal Empire died, but its legacy lived on in countless ways. The year 1857 erupted across northern India, like a long dormant volcano suddenly coming to life. What the British would dismissively call the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indians would later claim as the First War of Independence, represented something far more complex. The last desperate attempt to resurrect the Mughal Empire and, paradoxically, the catalyst for its final transformation into something entirely new. This radical reinvention would see the empire's political authority extinguished, while its cultural legacy was reborn in forms its founders could never have imagined. The spark came from an unlikely source: rumors that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers in the company's army. But the tinder had been accumulating for decades: dispossessed nobles, unemployed soldiers, overtaxed peasants, and traditionalists alarmed by aggressive Christianization. When the sepoys at Meerut mutinied on May 10, 1857, their first instinct was to march to Delhi and proclaim the aged Bahadur Shah Zafar, the powerless Mughal emperor, as their leader. This moment revealed the extraordinary persistence of Mughal legitimacy. Despite decades of humiliation, the empire remained the only institution that could unite diverse groups against foreign rule. Hindus and Muslims, princes and peasants, all rallied to the imperial standard. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed the empire might phoenix-like rise from its ashes. Bahadur Shah, a poet and mystic who had spent decades in genteel poverty, found himself proclaimed leader of a vast uprising. The emperor's proclamations during this period show a remarkable reinvention of Mughal ideology for new circumstances. Gone was the emphasis on Islamic supremacy that had characterized Aurangzeb's reign. Instead, Bahadur Shah appealed to a shared Hindustani identity, promising religious freedom and protection to all communities. His coins bore inscriptions honoring both Hindu and Muslim sentiments. His court, such as it was, included leaders from all faiths united against foreign domination. But this political reinvention was doomed from the start. The 82-year-old emperor had neither the resources nor the administrative machinery to coordinate a subcontinental uprising. Regional leaders pursued their own agendas. The British, after initial panic, mobilized overwhelming force. The siege of Delhi saw the city that had been the Mughal capital reduced to ruins. When the British recaptured it in September 1857, the reprisals were savage. Thousands were executed, including 3 of the emperor's sons, shot in cold blood at Humayun's tomb. The aftermath brought the most radical transformation yet. The Government of India Act 1858 formally ended both company rule and the Mughal Empire. Bahadur Shah was tried for treason, an irony for an emperor the British had previously recognized, and exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. The imperial family was scattered, many killed or reduced to penury. The Red Fort became a British military cantonment. It seemed the Mughal story had reached its final chapter. Yet even as political authority vanished, a cultural reinvention was beginning that would prove more enduring than any military victory. The British, needing to legitimize their rule, began seriously studying Mughal administration. They discovered systems of governance more sophisticated than they had realized. The land revenue arrangements, legal codes, and administrative divisions they inherited from the Mughals became the backbone of the Raj. British India was, in many ways, a continuation of Mughal India by other means. More profoundly, Indian intellectuals began reimagining the Mughal legacy for the modern age. The Aligarh movement, founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, sought to modernize Muslim education while preserving Mughal high culture. The Urdu language, child of the Mughal camps, was standardized and promoted as a vehicle for contemporary literature. Poets like Ghalib, who had witnessed the empire's destruction, created works that transformed personal loss into universal art. This cultural reinvention took multiple forms. In architecture, the Indo-Saracenic style consciously blended Mughal motifs with British engineering, creating buildings like the Victoria Memorial that paid homage to Mughal aesthetics while serving colonial purposes. In music, the Gharana system preserved and transmitted Mughal court traditions to new audiences. In cuisine, Mughal dishes moved from royal kitchens to public restaurants, democratizing imperial taste. The legal reinvention was particularly significant. The British retained much of the Mughal legal framework, especially in personal law. The Shariat Act of 1937 actually strengthened Islamic law's application to Muslims, something late Mughal emperors had struggled to enforce. The zamindari system, though modified, continued to govern rural relations. Mughal administrative terminology, from collector to tehsil, remained standard in Indian governance. Perhaps most remarkably, the idea of the Mughal Empire underwent radical reinvention in popular memory. As the pain of political collapse faded, nostalgia transformed the Mughal era into a golden age of cultural fusion and artistic achievement. The very British who had destroyed Mughal power began celebrating Mughal culture. Lord Curzon restored Mughal monuments, declaring them essential to India's heritage. The Taj Mahal, from a neglected tomb, became a symbol of India itself. This reinvention accelerated with the rise of Indian nationalism. Leaders like Nehru saw in the Mughal Empire a precedent for a unified secular India that transcended religious divisions. The Mughal composite culture provided a model for the inclusive nationalism they advocated. Even Hindu nationalists, while critiquing Muslim rule, acknowledged Mughal contributions to Indian civilization. The empire became a contested but crucial part of national memory. The partition of India in 1947 created new contexts for Mughal reinvention. In Pakistan, the Mughals were claimed as predecessors of an Islamic state, their tolerance downplayed in favor of their Muslim identity. In India, the secular aspects of Mughal rule were emphasized while religious elements were minimized. In Bangladesh, the Mughal period was remembered as a time of Bengal's prosperity and cultural flowering. Each new nation reinvented the Mughal legacy to serve contemporary needs. The diaspora created by partition spread Mughal cultural influences globally. Mughal cuisine became the face of Indian food worldwide. Mughal-inspired fashion influenced international designers. Bollywood films set in the Mughal era brought romanticized versions of imperial splendor to global audiences. The empire that had once connected Central Asia to India now connected South Asian communities worldwide through shared cultural references. Academic reinvention paralleled popular transformation. Historians moved beyond colonial narratives that portrayed the Mughals as despotic foreigners to nuanced analyses of their administrative innovations, economic policies, and cultural patronage. Art historians revealed the sophistication of Mughal aesthetics. Literary scholars explored the rich textual traditions fostered by imperial patronage. The Mughal Empire became not just a historical period, but a field of study illuminating broader questions about empire, culture, and identity. The digital age has brought new forms of reinvention. Virtual reconstructions allow people to walk through Mughal monuments as they existed at their height. Online archives make Mughal manuscripts accessible globally. Social media spreads appreciation for Mughal art, architecture, and culture to new generations. Video games set in the Mughal period introduce imperial history to young people worldwide. The empire exists more vividly in virtual space than it did in its final political decades. This radical reinvention reveals something profound about cultural resilience. The Mughal Empire's political structure proved brittle, collapsing when faced with new challenges. But its cultural innovations, administrative systems, and inclusive vision proved remarkably adaptable. Stripped of political power, these elements were free to evolve, influence, and inspire in ways that political authority might have constrained. As you drift toward deeper sleep, consider this remarkable transformation. An empire founded by Central Asian warriors became the cultural foundation for modern South Asian identity. The radical reinvention of the Mughal legacy shows how human achievements can transcend their original contexts, finding new life in unexpected forms. The last Mughal emperor died in exile, writing poetry of loss and longing. Yet his empire lives on in the aesthetic sensibilities of 1 billion people, in the administrative structures of modern states, in the vision that allows diverse communities to imagine shared futures. As the sun set on the political existence of the Mughal Empire in 1857, its vast territories and diverse peoples found themselves at a crossroads that would lead to radically different destinies. Like a great river reaching its delta and branching into countless streams, the unified imperial realm fragmented into regions, communities, and nations, each carrying forward different aspects of the Mughal legacy, while charting their own course through modernity. This divergence would create a complex tapestry where threads of the common Mughal past would be woven into strikingly different patterns. In Delhi, the ancient capital, the path forward was one of profound transformation and loss. The city that had been the beating heart of the empire became a British military cantonment and administrative center. The Red Fort, once the stage for imperial splendor, housed British barracks. The Jama Masjid, bereft of imperial patronage, struggled to maintain its religious functions. Yet among the ruins, a cultural resilience emerged. The poets and scholars who survived 1857 created a literary movement that would preserve Mughal high culture in new forms. Ghalib students established schools that taught Persian and Urdu to new generations, ensuring that the language of the court would survive the court itself. The path of the Mughal aristocracy diverged dramatically based on choices made during the uprising. Those who had supported the British found themselves rewarded with titles and estates, becoming the princely states that would persist until 1947. The Nizam of Hyderabad, tracing his authority to Mughal appointment, ruled a territory larger than many European nations. The Nawabs of Bhopal, remarkably ruled by a succession of women, created a progressive Muslim state that balanced tradition with modernity. These rulers maintained Mughal court ceremonies, patronized similar arts, and administered through systems inherited from the empire, creating pockets where Mughal political culture survived in evolved forms. Other aristocrats who had supported the uprising faced dispossession and exile. Many fled to the remaining Muslim kingdoms like Hyderabad, Bhopal, or Rampur, where they established schools, libraries, and cultural institutions that preserved Mughal learning. Some journeyed further to the Ottoman Empire or Afghanistan, carrying Mughal administrative and military expertise to new lands. The Mughal diaspora would influence governmental and cultural practices from Istanbul to Kabul, creating a transnational network of Mughal influence. The religious paths diverging from the Mughal composite culture proved particularly complex. For Muslims, the end of Mughal power created a crisis of identity. Some, like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, chose the path of modernization, establishing the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, later Aligarh Muslim University, to prepare Muslims for success in the British system while preserving Islamic culture. Others, centered at the Darul Uloom Deoband, chose a path of religious purification, rejecting Mughal syncretism in favor of scriptural orthodoxy. Still others, following the Barelvi tradition, maintained the folk Islam that had flourished under Mughal patronage, with its emphasis on Sufi shrines and popular devotion. For Hindus, the end of Mughal rule opened different possibilities. Some embraced the Mughal cultural legacy, particularly in music, poetry, and architecture. The Hindu patrons of Urdu poetry, the Rajput nobles who maintained Mughal administrative traditions, and the Hindu musicians who preserved Mughal court music demonstrated that Mughal culture transcended religious boundaries. Others saw the empire's end as an opportunity for Hindu revival, leading to movements that sought to purify Hinduism of Islamic influences, while ironically adopting organizational methods learned from Mughal administration. The Sikhs, who had suffered under late Mughal persecution but had also absorbed much from Mughal military and administrative culture, charted their own distinctive path. The Sikh empire of Ranjit Singh had already shown how Mughal methods could serve non-Muslim rulers. After the British conquest of Punjab, Sikhs would become prominent in the British Indian Army, carrying forward Mughal military traditions in British service while maintaining their distinct religious identity, forged partly in opposition to Mughal authority. Regional paths diverged dramatically based on local conditions and histories. In Bengal, the Mughal legacy merged with British influence to create the Bengal Renaissance, a flowering of literature, art, and social reform that drew on Mughal cosmopolitanism while embracing modern ideas. In the Deccan, the Nizam's domains preserved Mughal administration most completely, creating a unique political culture that blended Persian sophistication with Telugu and Marathi traditions. In Punjab, the Mughal tradition of canal irrigation was expanded by the British, transforming the region's agriculture while maintaining patterns established by Mughal engineers. The path of Mughal material culture diverged between preservation and transformation. The great monuments became archaeological sites under British protection, frozen in time rather than living spaces. Yet Mughal architectural principles continued to evolve in new constructions. Railway stations incorporated Mughal arches, British bungalows adopted Mughal gardens, and Indian princes built palaces that updated Mughal design for modern comfort. Mughal decorative arts found new patrons among British collectors and Indian merchants, leading to revivals and innovations in miniature painting, jewelry design, and textile production. The economic paths diverging from Mughal collapse varied by region and community. The banking families that had financed Mughal administration adapted to British rule, with houses like the Jagat Seths transitioning from imperial bankers to colonial financiers. Merchant communities that had thrived on Mughal trade routes adjusted to new patterns of global commerce centered on British ports. Artisan communities faced more difficult transitions as British industrial products displaced traditional crafts, though some, like the carpet weavers of Kashmir or the jewelers of Jaipur, found new international markets for Mughal-inspired products. The intellectual paths forward saw remarkable creativity. Persian scholarship, the hallmark of Mughal learning, declined but didn't disappear. Urdu emerged as a major literary language, carrying forward the Mughal tradition of linguistic fusion. Historical writing flourished as Indians sought to understand their past, producing works that ranged from nostalgic memoirs of Mughal glory to critical analyses of imperial decline. The tradition of Indo-Islamic philosophy continued in new institutions, adapting Mughal-era debates to contemporary concerns. By the early 20th century, these divergent paths had created a subcontinent of remarkable variety, united by shared Mughal memories. The independence movements that emerged drew on different aspects of the Mughal legacy. Secular nationalists celebrated Mughal pluralism. Muslim League leaders invoked Mughal glory. Regional movements referenced Mughal provincial autonomy. The very idea of a unified India owed much to the Mughal precedent of subcontinental empire. The partition of 1947 represented the most dramatic divergence, creating two nations that claimed different aspects of the Mughal inheritance. Pakistan positioned itself as the successor to Muslim rule, with its capital eventually moving near the Mughal mountain retreats. India claimed the Mughal tradition of composite culture, with the Red Fort serving as the stage for Independence Day celebrations. The tragedy of partition, with its massive displacement and violence, eerily echoed the chaos following Mughal collapse, suggesting how deeply imperial patterns shaped even the rejection of empire. Post-independence paths continued to diverge. In India, the Mughal legacy became part of a contested national heritage, celebrated in tourism and culture while debated in politics. In Pakistan, Mughal history was reinterpreted to support an Islamic national identity. In Bangladesh, emerging later, the Mughal period was remembered as a time of Bengali prosperity before colonial exploitation. Each nation created museums, preserved monuments, and taught history in ways that emphasized different aspects of the shared past. As you approach the deepest phase of sleep, consider how these divergent paths, like light passing through a prism, separated the white light of Mughal civilization into a spectrum of distinct colors. Each path carried forward some aspect of the imperial legacy: administrative efficiency, artistic beauty, religious fusion, cultural sophistication, or political ambition. The divergence was not a betrayal of the Mughal legacy, but its fulfillment. An empire built on accommodation and adaptation could hardly have a monolithic afterlife. Instead, it lived on in countless forms, each finding different soil and growing into different forms, yet all carrying the genetic material of their origin. As the 21st century advances, the Mughal Empire, which formally ended over a century and a half ago, resonates through time with an intensity that would have astonished both its founders and destroyers. Like the intricate patterns of a Mughal garden, where each element reflects and reinforces the whole, the empire's influence permeates modern life in ways both obvious and subtle, creating an eternal echo that shapes how millions understand beauty, power, identity, and possibility. In the gleaming galleries of museums from New York to Tokyo, Mughal artifacts draw crowds who marvel at their timeless elegance. A jade wine cup carved for Jahangir, its surface smooth as water and green as spring, speaks across centuries of an aesthetic that found divinity in perfection of form. Miniature paintings, their colors still vivid after 400 years, reveal a world where every gesture had meaning and every detail deserved attention. These objects, scattered across the globe, serve as ambassadors of a civilization that believed art was not mere decoration, but a window into truth itself. The eternal echo resonates most powerfully in architecture. The Taj Mahal, that supreme achievement of Mughal design, has become perhaps the world's most recognizable building, its image reproduced countless times, yet never losing its capacity to inspire awe. But beyond this iconic monument, Mughal architectural principles continue to influence contemporary design. Modern architects in South Asia and beyond incorporate Mughal elements: the pointed arch, the bulbous dome, the integration of water and garden into hospitals, hotels, airports, and homes. The Mughal insight that buildings should uplift the spirit while serving practical needs remains as relevant today as it was 4 centuries ago. In the realm of governance, the Mughal echo persists in unexpected ways. The administrative structures of modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh rest on foundations laid by Todar Mal and refined by generations of Mughal administrators. The district collector, that key figure in South Asian administration, performs functions defined by Mughal precedent. Land records, revenue systems, and judicial procedures across the subcontinent retain Mughal DNA, adapted for democratic rather than imperial rule, but recognizable in their systematic approach to managing diverse populations. Language carries the eternal echo most intimately into daily life. Urdu, the language born in Mughal military camps, is spoken by hundreds of millions, its poetry recited at weddings and protests alike. Hindi, profoundly influenced by the Persian vocabulary introduced by the Mughals, serves as India's link language. English itself, in its South Asian variant, incorporates thousands of words of Mughal origin, from Mughal, meaning a powerful person, to Kushi from the Persian Kushi, meaning pleasure. Every South Asian speaking any language uses words and concepts that entered the subcontinent through Mughal agency. The culinary echo of the Mughals flavors daily life across the subcontinent and increasingly the world. Biryani, that perfect marriage of Persian pilaf and Indian spices, graces tables from Dhaka to Delhi. Kebabs perfected in Mughal kitchens are sold on street corners and in five-star hotels. The Mughal insight that food should delight all senses, visual presentation as important as taste, aroma as crucial as texture, influences how millions understand cuisine. Indian restaurants worldwide, whether in London or Los Angeles, serve dishes whose recipes trace back to imperial kitchens. In the creative arts, the Mughal echo shapes contemporary expression. Films set in the Mughal era create imagined versions of imperial splendor that influence fashion, wedding design, and popular understanding of history. Classical music, both Hindustani and Carnatic traditions, preserves ragas and performance styles refined in Mughal courts. Contemporary artists deconstruct and reimagine Mughal miniature painting for modern sensibilities, proving that imperial aesthetics remain a living tradition capable of speaking to current concerns. The echo resonates in religious life across confessional boundaries. The syncretic tradition, fostered by Akbar, despite later reversals, established patterns of coexistence and mutual influence that persist. Hindu festivals incorporate Mughal-era customs, Muslim practices in South Asia reflect Hindu influences, and Sikh tradition, forged partly in opposition to Mughal power, nonetheless absorbed Mughal concepts of sovereignty and justice. The great Sufi shrines, patronized by Mughal emperors and visited by devotees of all faiths, remain centers of popular spirituality that transcend sectarian division. In education, the Mughal emphasis on cultivating refined sensibility alongside practical knowledge echoes through contemporary institutions. The tradition of the Ustad-Shagird relationship in music and crafts maintains Mughal patterns of knowledge transmission. Universities across South Asia, teaching everything from engineering to medicine, incorporate cultural education that reflects Mughal beliefs about complete human development. The idea that education should produce not just skilled professionals, but cultured individuals owes much to Mughal precedent. The global echo of Mughal civilization extends far beyond South Asia. In fashion capitals, designers draw inspiration from Mughal textiles and jewelry. The paisley pattern, derived from Mughal design, appears on everything from haute couture to mass-market clothing. Mughal-inspired gardens grace properties worldwide, their geometric patterns and water features creating oases of tranquility. The Mughal aesthetic of refined luxury influences international hospitality, with hotels from Dubai to Las Vegas incorporating imperial motifs. The psychological echo may be the most profound. The Mughal example of a successful multi-religious, multi-ethnic empire provides a model for those advocating pluralistic societies. The composite culture achieved by the Mughals, never perfect, often contested, but remarkably creative, offers lessons for our globalized world grappling with diversity. When contemporary leaders speak of unity and multiplicity, they consciously or unconsciously echo Mughal precedents. When artists blend traditions to create fusion forms, they follow paths pioneered by Mughal court artists. Yet the eternal echo also includes discordant notes. The memory of Mughal rule remains contested, particularly in Hindu nationalist narratives that emphasize conflict over cooperation. Debates over Mughal monuments, with some calling for their destruction or renaming, show how imperial echoes can divide as well as unite. The very intensity of these debates proves that the Mughal legacy remains emotionally charged, too significant to be relegated to dusty history books. Environmental echoes remind us of Mughal wisdom about living harmoniously with nature. The Charbagh garden design, with its emphasis on water conservation and microclimate creation, offers lessons for sustainable urban planning. Mughal techniques of rainwater harvesting and irrigation, refined over centuries, provide models for addressing contemporary water scarcity. The integration of gardens into architectural complexes, standard in Mughal design, anticipates modern understanding of biophilic design's importance for human well-being. In personal life, the Mughal echo shapes how millions mark significant moments. Weddings across South Asia, regardless of religion, often incorporate Mughal-inspired clothing, jewelry, and ceremonies. The tradition of elaborate hospitality, of celebrating life's passages with beauty and generosity, reflects imperial court customs democratized for ordinary people. When a middle-class family saves for years to host a wedding that briefly recreates imperial splendor, they participate in the eternal echo of Mughal grandeur. As you prepare for sleep, having journeyed through the entire arc of Mughal history, consider how this eternal echo surrounds us, like the night air itself, invisible but essential, unnoticed but omnipresent. Every time someone reads Urdu poetry, savors biryani, admires a pointed arch, or advocates for religious harmony, they participate in the Mughal legacy. Every scholar studying Persian manuscripts, every musician practicing a raga, every architect designing a garden, every official maintaining land records continues work begun under Mughal patronage. The eternal echo teaches us that empires truly end not when their last emperor dies, but when their cultural contributions cease to inspire. By this measure, the Mughal Empire remains vibrantly alive. Its political structures may have crumbled, but its vision of beauty, inclusion, and possibility continues to shape imagination and aspiration. From the villages of Bengal, where Mughal-era folk songs are still sung, to the galleries of international museums, where curators carefully preserve imperial artifacts, from the kitchens where grandmothers pass down Mughal recipes, to the conservatories where students learn Mughal musical traditions, the echo continues. This is the final transformation, from temporal power to timeless influence, from political authority to cultural inspiration, from empire of territory to empire of imagination. The Mughals, who began as foreign conquerors, became so deeply woven into the fabric of South Asian civilization that their removal would unravel the whole. Their legacy proves that while military might fades and dynasties fall, the human capacity to create beauty, forge unity from diversity, and imagine transcendent possibility echoes through eternity. As sleep finally claims you, let the story of the Mughal Empire remind you of humanity's remarkable capacity for transformation. The eternal echo of the Mughal Empire is ultimately a reminder that what we create with vision and dedication can outlive us by centuries, influencing people we will never meet in ways we cannot imagine. The Mughals have passed into history, but their echo continues, eternal and evolving, a testament to the enduring power of human creativity to transcend the limitations of time and mortality.